Hi, my name is Jennifer Breeden, and I'm a visiting assistant professor of business at Quincy University. I've also spent many years working with the trucking industry, and that's what I want to talk about today, getting real with driver retention, the culture shift that's needed in the trucking industry. So over and over again, for years now, right, we've heard about the driver shortage. It's been a problem. It's still a problem. It's certainly nothing new. We've been seeing the headline for years, and those in the industry have been feeling the shortage for years. So why can't we find a solution? If this has been around for so long, why can't we find a solution? I've been in and around the transportation industry for over 15 years, and this problem has plagued the industry for most, if not all, of those 15 years. It's almost elusive in nature, isn't it? Kind of out of reach. The issue we cannot seem to solve. So why can't we solve it? Why? And that's what drives my motivation to try and understand it. The fact is, we've made some progress in understanding the problem. I read an industry publication study just last week noting that feeling appreciated is the second biggest factor in retaining logistics talent. Now, this is across the board in the logistics field, not just drivers, but generally speaking, feeling appreciated is a significant factor. And this data makes sense. There's countless studies over the years, countless publications that have noted the need to make employees feel appreciated. And in my discussion with those in the industry, we've made positive changes. So it seems we're on track, right? But why do we continue to largely miss the mark with one key employee group, drivers? While the key to solving the driver shortage is an elusive one, and I don't claim to have all the answers, in my 15 plus years of working with those in the transportation industry, I've had the privilege of getting to know many, many drivers. I've met with them, talked with them, and asked them to share with me their biggest concerns, complaints, daily frustrations, what they love about the job, everything. And I've noticed the same themes keep coming up. I set out some months ago to dig into the problem of driver turnover and what keeps drivers at their jobs. And in my preliminary work, I found the most intriguing thing. When I talk with drivers about working in the industry, I keep getting the same responses today as I did 15 years ago. The same exact responses, which I'll get into in a bit. But initially I had to ask myself, if I'm getting the same responses, just me, in my quest to understand the driver shortage, if I'm getting the same responses for 15 years, is the problem really that elusive? This led me to a couple key factors that I believe will help to solve the driver shortage problem. It involves a long-term plan for both experienced drivers that have been in the driver's seat for more than 10, 20, 30 years, and new drivers just entering the industry. First, we need to talk to drivers. Simple, right? Just talk to them. Actually talk to them. And more importantly, we need to listen and take action based on what we hear. This is going to lead to a shift in the culture within any company if we just actively listen and try to understand. And second, when it comes to new drivers, we need to get real with them. And what that means is letting them know what the position really involves. As we dive into these two concepts, listening and getting real, let me explain how I arrived at this. Let me go back a few years to my start in transportation. Until that point in my career, I was an accountant, an auditor and a tax accountant with honestly zero academic background at that time in supply chain management or logistics. As it does, life presented a really unexpected opportunity to work in the dispatch department of a large company that has their own fleet of several hundred over-the-road truck drivers. I jumped into that role, started the graduate program in logistics and supply chain management to strengthen my formal background in the industry. I moved up quickly into one of the handful of dispatcher positions, and it was really interesting. It was great. Loved the position. And I learned something very quickly, something my academic background didn't provide to me. I needed to know what the driver job entailed. And I don't mean the job description that we all see on recruitment websites, we all put on recruitment websites. I mean, I needed to know what it really requires for a person to be in that driver position. While my initial motivation to understand the driver position was to be able to perform my job better, it quickly changed to a desire to understand so that I could help make drivers' jobs easier. I interacted with them every day. I got to know them, and I understood really quickly that there were a lot of frustrations with their job. There are a lot of challenges. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of fear. And looking back after years of being involved in the industry, I think the one key factor is having respect and conveying that respect to them. Genuine mutual respect for one another. How have I gotten some of the most avoidant, won't talk to the office drivers to share everything with me that they like and don't like about their jobs for, in some cases, 15 years? Let's be honest, any of us who's worked with drivers knows the ones that fit this description. There's ones that simply don't want to open up and share the information. But the answer is respect, which in turn leads to trust. To be honest, when I set out on my latest project to try to better understand this issue of the driver shortage and retention, I thought what I would find would be different. I had my thoughts on what the problems would be that would be highlighted. And that's the fun part about what I do in academics and when I do research, is trying to solve a business problem, trying to research a problem, whatever I'm trying to dig into. Sometimes you get the answer you don't always expect. So what is really going to help end the driver shortage? As I mentioned before, two things. I suggest with trucking companies that the transportation industry needs to shift the culture from the idea of what it means to listen to drivers and instead really listen to drivers. And two, get real with new drivers. Again, covering what the job position actually is ahead of time or early on in the process. It sounds easy enough, right? But the fact is it isn't. I've talked to countless drivers, as I've mentioned, over the past few years at multiple companies. I have drivers I've built really strong working relationships with that will give me honest, candid feedback and answers. They're always willing to jump in and help me understand what's going on, because at the end of the day, they want the job to be better. They want new drivers to enjoy the job. They want to be better at their job. So this is key. These relationships that I've built are the keys to getting answers and making the changes that I'm going to explain. So let's dig into this area of shifting the culture. What exactly do we need to change? So I have a couple steps that I'll outline. Putting yourself in the driver role, and then understanding drivers are the #1 source of information. So when I set out to start talking to drivers specifically about their desire to stay in their job or to leave, I thought I would uncover a clear cause. And to be clear, I talked with experienced drivers for this part, with 10, 20, 30 years experience. I talked to drivers that run open board without a dedicated. I talked to drivers with 1 dedicated load per week. I talked to drivers with multiple dedicated loads per week, trying to address all angles. The drivers that have jobs that are very unknown from week to week, and drivers that have jobs that rarely change ever, really. So to cover all that, I thought that I would find that experienced drivers would echo the same thoughts that they've expressed to me briefly and over the years, complaints about their ability to do their day-to-day jobs and their at-home time, which focuses often on the restrictions they face from switching to electronic logs. I truly thought at the beginning of this that this would be one of the primary reasons for retention struggles. But what I found was that it's not. So electronic logs were certainly mentioned by every driver I talked to. I mean, it's a factor. It impacts their day-to-day, but that's not the reason that they are displeased with their jobs to the point of considering leaving. And oftentimes with new drivers, not the reason that they are not comfortable with the job either. It was more of what I called a secondary annoyance rather than the primary cause. So electronic logs definitely changed the job. No argument there. But at the same time, it's not necessarily the reason for the retention issue, which is what I kind of thought I would find. So what do we need to do? What does the trucking industry need to do to solve this driver shortage? What do employers need to do to retain the drivers they have? And I wish there was an easy answer. I wish I could say I had a new theory or framework to solve the problem overnight. But unfortunately, it's the opposite. My discussions over the years, again, 15 plus years, suggest that a long-term plan is required to shift the culture and build the necessary trust. But in my years of experience, this long-term benefit is definitely worth this extra effort. So generally speaking, I'm sure many watching will agree with this. Companies do talk to their drivers and they ask for their input, at least at times. And this is really important. Don't get me wrong, this is really important. Whether asking for input at a safety meeting, via surveys, some sort of informal brief gathering of information, that's all critical, it's all important, and it gives us some valuable information. And it's a good first step in shifting that culture to a culture of trust that allows drivers to feel like they're being heard. But those type of interactions just aren't quite enough, especially true when they express concerns and never see changes, or they never hear any thoughts or further feedback on their ideas. It's one thing if you share an idea and then later on somebody tells you, you know what, it just didn't work, it doesn't fit for the company, and this is why. That's what needs to happen. If they never hear anything again, then it quickly gets dismissed as, why should I care? Why should I share information? Nobody's going to follow up on it. They don't want to hear it anyway. So this is what we need to move away from. Some suggestions just truly aren't feasible or positive for the company. And any driver I've talked to understands that's the case. They understand it's a business. But when there's no follow-up and they don't understand why a change may not occur, that's when it becomes difficult. And that's when you lose that trust that may already be there. So let's establish one important aspect of this culture shift. Those in the transportation industry in positions not on the road, those in the office, initially have really little credibility with drivers. You have to earn that credibility, especially with experienced drivers that have been on the road, that have seen everything, experienced a lot of unknowns throughout the years. If you walk in as an office position, they don't care what your background is if you've never driven a truck. You're going to have to earn that credibility. And I think that's really important for anybody that's in any level of position dealing with drivers, is understanding that you have to, again, earn that trust, but also earn that credibility. You haven't sat behind a driver's seat and they know that. And that's a huge difference between your position and their position. And one thing, a lot of companies do the ride-alongs. Those are really important. I think those are valuable too. But once a year, once a quarter, ride-along just isn't quite enough. It does give you insight into, what the day-to-day looks like, but it's just not enough to actually fully understand what the driver position entails. And therefore, it's just not quite enough to build that trust, that deeper level of trust with drivers that is so important to shifting this culture and being able to access information that we need. So because it's so critical, I want to take a moment today working on understanding drivers. So let's just take a few minutes. Consider a day in the life of a driver. Have you done that? Have you ever sat back for just a moment and thought about, if you've never driven a truck, never driven over the road, sat back and thought about what a day in a life of a driver looks like? Not the stops they have to make, the deliveries they have to make, the warehouses they go to, the truck stops they have to stop at, not that. I mean, that's all important too, but that's not the most important. So let's pause for just a second and imagine you're a driver. So you just left home, saying goodbye to your family, your spouse. Maybe you had to talk with your kids about school. Told your oldest to do well at the game they have the next night that you're going to miss again. Telling him to have his mom take some good pictures like last time so you can see how they did. You told your spouse, don't worry about that unplanned expense that came up over the weekend. You'll figure it out this week while you're on the road. And grab your bag, your clothes, food, make sure everything's there, turn around, wave goodbye, get in your car and drive to work. To leave, to encounter all the unknowns on the road, hoping everything goes fine, just as it did the week before, and that you'll get to return home to see your family in a few days. And as a driver, you get to work and you typically spend an hour or more getting everything ready on the yard, pre-trip inspection, paperwork, loading your refrigerator, bedding, clothes, just organizing your truck, because this is where you live for the next few days. As you get to work, you find out your load is going to be delayed. It happens, but hopefully not too long. So you spend the extra time waiting and thinking about the unfinished things you just left at home. You think about how late you might be because your load's delayed. You might have to drive all night now to get to your delivery on time. You probably won't be able to stop at that truck stop that you're used to sleeping at because you'll be running behind and you'll have to drive further. So you have to figure out, okay, where am I going to stop? You've been on the route before and you're hoping there's parking, but as the night drags on, parking becomes less and less available. So you finally get to leave about an hour later than planned. You get on the road, turn the music on, listen to the game because your favorite team is playing. You hope this distraction will allow you to clear your head from the issues at home, big or small. A couple hours into the trip, traffic stops because of a wreck ahead. As you get to drive on, you pass the wreck. You see the ambulances, the police, the vehicles involved, and you can't help but think about how bad it looks or what happens to those involved. You also can't ignore the fact that you're now another 30 minutes behind. You try to push that thought aside and drive. Your wife calls a few minutes later and says, hey, one of the kids isn't behaving. You're frustrated, she's frustrated, but what can you do from 200 miles away? As you hang up and face the next 5 hours alone in the night with nothing but time to drive and think, drive and think. Thoughts about what you need to do at the house, thoughts about what your wife was telling you she's frustrated that you're never home for things, thoughts of your son trying to smile to hide the disappointment of you missing that next game, thoughts of financial complications, thoughts of a friend that's been struggling with a health issue, thoughts of everything. Call a friend for a while. Remember that somebody he left about the same time as you, try to help pass the miles, help clear your mind. As you get to the truck stop, hope there's parking, hope you can get some sleep because you're gonna have to get up earlier the next morning because you ran late. The reality is also, as it snaps back to you, that you're driving at 80,000 pounds down the road at 65 miles an hour plus. As you enter a city, 2 lanes turn to 4. Now you've got brake lights, drivers making questionable decisions to pass you, almost stopping in front of you, to the side. So, have you ever stopped and thought about it? That scenario that I just covered. Have you ever stopped and put yourself in that driver's life? Again, not just observing things on a ride along, although that gives you great insight, as I said, but actually pausing and putting yourself in the position of what happens in their lives. The fact is, I could have described a million different scenarios, but you get the idea. The truth is, this is essentially every driver I've ever spoken to in my career in some form or variation or another. And the scenario I just described has little to do with many of the extra factors of driving the truck. You blow a tire, your truck's making a strange noise, you have to call the shop, it's raining, the wind's blowing, there's sleet, there's snow, there's mountains, and on, right? I mean, there's so many factors in actually driving the truck. So this was just a day in the life. And actually, in my scenario, it was about 5 hours in one single day in the life of a driver. Now repeat this 5 days a week, week after week. To create that culture that leads to driver retention, we have to understand this as step 1 of shifting the culture. We have to understand that every single interaction that your company has with one of your drivers, some variation of that scenario I went through is going on in the background, unknown to us on most occasions. As a dispatcher, when I was a dispatcher, I always made myself available to drivers because I learned pretty quickly that this scenarios like those were going on with every driver every day of the week. And I made myself available to drivers to talk. I spent hours on the phone. with so many of them in the evenings, on my daily commute to the office, just listening. It wasn't a requirement of my job. I wasn't paid to do that. But still to this day, I hear from drivers who tell me that they appreciate that I always tried to actually understand them. It isn't that I listened to whatever problem they were having in their lives at that moment. It was that I showed them that I understood one critical part of their job that tends to be overlooked, that their jobs don't have a start and an end time each day, and that personal life is almost always blended with their professional lives at all times. You see, what makes a driver's job different than most of ours is that we have times to deal with personal pressures, and times we set them to the side because we have work requirements that we know will typically be done at a certain hour, and we can pick those thoughts back up again. And we've all been stuck at work longer than we've intended, many times in our careers that happens. But generally speaking, we know that workday is going to come to an end. A driver's life never really is able to separate those two. Their workday and their personal day are often blended one and the same. And that gives them, like I said, most of the time they're free to think. In fact, throughout the years, I've, again, talked to drivers, they're very open and candid with me, and they've repeatedly told me the single biggest challenge they face of the entire job as a truck driver, an over-the-road driver, is time to think. Not logbooks, not mechanical concerns with their truck or trailer, not time on a customer dock or unloading issues, not other drivers on the road, not weather, not a whole host of other factors that we think of. Instead, the biggest challenge is time to think. And this is repeatedly reported by drivers with, even, as I've said before, 20 to 30 years experience, that they're already skilled in handling those unknowns and the constant challenges of actually being on the road. They're comfortable with that. The problem is also significantly worse for new drivers who then lack that confidence. They're still trying to navigate how to make decisions on the road, when to pull over, how to deal with mechanical issues on the road, just inexperience in traffic issues. Again, the list goes on. So this is so important and critical that we understand that if drivers are reporting for years upon years to me, anytime I've dug into this topic, that time to think is the biggest issue, we need to take a different look at how we're approaching the job. So, and just as a component of this, I think one that's definitely related and we can't ignore is the importance of emotional and mental support. Many companies have resources available. It can be tough for drivers to make that decision to reach out for that, and to find time in your home off the road, which is often very little for them, to be able to access those resources can be challenging. So I definitely recommend also the companies, as part of this culture shift, take some time to kind of address the availability of these type of resources for drivers too, and providing training for office staff and others in that roles that interact with drivers to just recognize that these resources are available and when a driver might need them. Because again, the pressure, the time, that is what they're continuing to report is the biggest issue. And that's why there really is power in listening to drivers, just giving them someone to hear them. So step 2 then of our achieving this culture shift, we need to understand that no matter how many years we have at the desk, I've sat behind the dispatch desk, like I said, for a few years myself, how many degrees, certificates, certifications we have. The drivers are our eyes, our ears, and our ability to understand the transportation industry. They really are. And when I've talked to drivers specifically about this topic, I also noticed some recurring themes, and I'll call them rules because the drivers that I've talked to, that's kind of how they approach them. When I ask them what managers and dispatchers do and what they should not do with respect to information gathering. So I just want to share a few of those rules with you. And these are ones that I've collected from, again, talking to drivers. So the first one, do not call a driver and tell them to keep driving because the online traffic cameras don't show bad weather. The point being, ask the driver. Ask the driver. They'll make a decision. They'll tell you if it's safe or if it's not safe. And to tell them, you're using resources aside from them to make that decision is not a positive one. It's not usually well received. So again, turning to them for that actual information is usually the best way to go. Rule number 2 that they provided me with: do not call a driver and tell them it's fine to drive all night because their load was delayed. They'll make the decision if it's safe. We all feel time pressure. Again, I've sat in that dispatch seat. I've needed to get loads to where they needed to be. And it's my responsibility also when I'm in that role. I understand that. But again, we have to turn to drivers to help have them make that decision. Again, building that trust, building that respect, the fact that you at least engage them and ask them, what their opinions are on where they're at and how tired they are, can go a long ways again in building those relationships. Rule number 3, don't order a driver what to do. Seek their input just as you would any other employee in an office position. Just because they're not there, just because, we all deal with, interact with people working with us that are not, right there with us anyway, virtual environments and things like that. But drivers are no different. They're an employee just as any other employee, and they can give you some really valuable information. So again, not just assuming that we have the best answer when we're sitting in the office. Ask them, just ask them. Most of them are pretty happy to help. Rule 4, don't tell a driver about a policy change directly related to driving a truck, and it's the best option for the company if you have not considered input from the drivers. And this goes back to the beginning where I was saying that, if drivers give you suggestions for changes, largely they understand if something is not feasible in the business, in the company. They'll understand that. They know there's costs involved. Most of them are fairly familiar with the business, especially if they've been driving for a while. But if you make a policy change that especially directly related to driving the truck and don't consider them or don't give them feedback as to maybe why their suggestions weren't implemented, then that can be damaging to this idea of building trust. So I had an example for this one, for this rule number 4. And this has come up more than once too in my conversations, but restricting driving speed. So it's pretty common, restrict driving speed, 60, 65 miles an hour or something for a truck to set it for a variety of reasons. One reason can be to, save fuel and things like that. And that's understandable, and drivers understand that. But there's other considerations. And one that came up that I thought was interesting, and so I wanted to share it as an example that I would not have thought of because I'm not a truck driver and I've not been behind the wheel and not seeing this every day, not experiencing this restricted driving speed. But when a driver's, let's say, in the high elevation or mountains or changing elevation, the speed restriction can become unsafe. I've had multiple drivers tell me that, and they become frustrated when they try to express to their companies that the fact that they are slowed down so significantly when they're on an incline that it becomes unsafe for the traffic around them. So, there are a lot of good reasons, again, for restricting driving speed, not saying there's not, but maybe consider the safety reasons also. But most importantly, the takeaway from this, talk to the drivers, let them know they're being heard. And if there's some reason why that shouldn't be changed, then speak to them about that. Just interact with them like any other employee. So the moral of the story, those of us in the office, again, are not the ones with the information related to conditions on the road. We're not. We're just simply not. And drivers are our eyes, our ears, and our knowledge base of best practices. We talk in business a lot about best practices, and that's critical. But we need to turn to the right resources to identify what those best practices are. And a lot of times turning to drivers as our first source of information, that is the best way to get the ideal processes and practices in place that we should have related to driving a truck. They're doing it firsthand. So not only does this approach give us the best source of information, but it also contributes to step 1 that I mentioned, which is listening to drivers to help build respect. When you turn to them for information, it does help build those critical relationships. All right, so the second part of solving the driver shortage is to be realistic about the driver position. We need to understand that new drivers, they don't know what the job entails. And a lot of times we put out job ads that are really enticing, good pay, good job, good benefits, good company, but is it really serving that long-term solution? We need to tell anyone who's willing to take that seat behind the wheel what the job's really about. The driver shortage has been impacting the transportation industry, supply chain considerations, and the bottom line of companies, of course, for way too long. So the enticements that we're putting in job ads, just as simple as it may sound, advertising the pay and focusing on that, or advertising, home time is better at this job than another, is that really accomplishing what we need to accomplish? And that is my question. Because otherwise we just end up spending money training new drivers to fill a seat for short term, for a few months, maybe a couple of years, until they decide the job's not for them. And that typically is what happens more often than not. We have a lot of turnover in the industry because honestly, people just don't understand what the job really entails. The scenario I read through, earlier that I went through, it, again, that's every driver in some form close to that scenario every day of their working life. And, new drivers, while we tell them that, at driver training, we try to explain what the job's about. It's just not being communicated enough or early enough in the process is kind of my take on it. So as part of my project, I thought, well, I'll turn to these experienced drivers that I have really good rapport with, speak with them, again, 10 plus years experience driving over the road, ask them what they think about new drivers, get their perspective on why new drivers struggle so much in the driving position. A lot of them have already spent a career's worth of time driving over the road. So what do they think? What's going on? They see new drivers come and go at their companies. They hear, some things from them. And so what's their take? Again, turning to drivers for this information. The answer from every single driver that I talked to was that new drivers lack work ethic or job knowledge. Work ethic. And when I started to uncover that, I was like, wow, that's fairly blunt and unfavorable. But do experienced drivers really perceive that new drivers have bad work ethic? It just seemed so negative and it seemed unlikely. So I decided to just kind of dig into it a little bit more, get a little bit more detail, I suppose, related to it, and elaborate on, what they meant by lack of work ethic when it relates to new drivers. So I dug a little bit more, got their perspectives, and the issue doesn't seem to be work ethic in the true sense. Instead, it's that new drivers have a lot of these problems going on in the background, again, that they're not able to express or don't know that they should express. And it's coming across as them not wanting to do their job or wanting to quit. And that's being perceived as a lack of work ethic by experienced drivers. But instead, what the new drivers are typically facing, as I've talked to many of them, lack of confidence and fear of the unknown situations. Every day driving on the road, there's so many countless unknown situations that pop up. Lack of understanding about home time, lack of understanding about unloading schedules, and just simply trouble navigating that work-life balance. Those phone calls from home, about problems, those phone calls from home about things that are good, but they're missing them. All of that. That is what seems to be really driving a lot of the quick turnover among new drivers. And I thought, wow, right, if I experience all those issues that I just noted, their lack of confidence, fearful, not understanding what the job entails, I probably wouldn't want to stay in that job role either. So how do new drivers train, get behind the wheel, and drive for months or even a couple of years without this being discovered? Because it happens every day. And that's why we have turnover with new drivers that are maybe a year or two experience or just a few months experience and decide, no, this isn't for me. So like I said, first we need to turn back to my initial suggestion, talking to drivers and listening to them. But the bigger picture is that I think that we in the industry need to face is that the idea that not every person that is enticed by that job ad is meant to be a truck driver. Just because they're willing to take the training, get behind the wheel, maybe even spend a few weeks on the road, it just may not be the best fit for them. And I think we need to start making sure we see the driver position for what it is, a specialized position, both in skill and personality traits. And I think we need to consider fit before we worry about filling driver seats. Again, filling driver seats is a short-term solution, but is it the best for any company in the long term? Probably not. So fit, the concept of fit, has been studied for a number of years in the human resources field. It's widely cited in academic research. It's widely cited in trade publications. It's an important factor in the hiring process. It is widely noted and accepted as an indicator of turnover and retention, both in many, many industries. But I argue that while it's considered the hiring process for many job positions in many industries, and maybe even in the transportation field, is it considered enough for truck drivers? Are we assessing fit in the driver hiring process? And my take on it, from what I've seen over the time, is that I don't think so. I don't think we're critically assessing fit. And I think it's being overlooked, and we need to look at it. I mean, think about the standard path to becoming a truck driver. Someone completes a driver school. It's often affiliated with multiple trucking companies, promises new drivers a job, essentially guaranteed once they complete their training. A lot of times there's guaranteed pay for the first year. It sounds great. But who's assessing fit during this process? I mean, there may be times at which we're talking about what the position entails. Again, trying to give new drivers the idea of that scenario I described at the beginning of being on the road, running late, not knowing where to park, dealing with things at home, all of it. That may come up, but when are we really assessing fit? And then also asking that job applicant, that potential driver, to assess if this is a good fit for them. So, you know, and the fact is, a new driver may perform well in the classroom. They may be able to navigate the driving school road experience really well. They may even be in with a driver trainer at a company for a few weeks and do just fine. That's not the same as being alone on the road. And it doesn't suggest that they can navigate all the uncertainties on the road while balancing the pressures of being away from home. And even if they can, do they want to? And I think this is a really important question that is perhaps getting overlooked, is whether or not, you know, we're addressing this issue of fit with drivers during the hiring process. So I want to spend just a moment explaining fit as a concept. So bigger picture, we have in that field of study, person-environment fit, and it encompasses 4 different types of fit underneath that umbrella of person-environment fit. Person-organization fit, person-job fit, person-group fit, and person-supervisor fit. Those 4 types are kind of widely accepted as, you know, the fit concept. But I think specifically as it comes to the driver shortage problem, driver turnover, especially with new drivers, I think person-organization fit and person-job fit are the 2 that we really need to spend some time kind of understanding and making sure that we're assessing in that hiring process. So person-organization fit, you know, just as the name suggests, is how well a person fits within the company itself. So does the company culture match the individual's personality, comfort levels, what they enjoy? Is the work environment positive? Is it not? Is it a stressful environment within the company as a whole? So that's one factor. Do you like the company you work for? That sort of question. And that can be kind of tough early on, you know, especially with new job applicants, new drivers in the hiring process, and you know, communicating to them what the company is like. But again, it's just something that both the company and the driver need to take a look at. You know, does the company feel like it's a good fit? And the other type of fit, which I think applies most in the driver shortage problem, is person-job fit. And I've kind of alluded to it throughout my presentation here, but person-job fit, again, as the name would suggest, is how well a person fits within a specific job role. How good of a match are they as far as personality traits, comfort level, and the job itself? And like I said, you know, with drivers, they're not necessarily aware of what the job role entails. And so this is where I think we need to move away from just trying to entice people to fill seats and end that shortage, which is only a short-term solution. And again, find the right people, the people who want to be truck drivers, and able to enact the long-term solution and hopefully help with the shortage long-term, not just short-term. But with both types of fit, if fit is not assessed properly, like I said, it could lead to turnover. And lack of fit between, like I said, the person and the job is what I think we need to understand most for the driver position. Not everyone's meant to be a truck driver, and that's okay. So putting the concepts in action. So the culture shift and getting real with new drivers. So just to kind of go over the things that I suggested here. Listening to drivers, of course, I've talked about that quite a bit. We need to listen to drivers. That's what helps build those relationships. We need to be realistic with new drivers about the job position, shifting that culture to one of listening and respect. And we need to consider fit in the hiring process. Neither one of these ideas I'm sharing really are anything new. They're not new concepts. They've been around. And so many great ideas and insights have been uncovered over the years in articles and in research. But where we fail is in the application of the concepts. And every company is different. That's the harsh reality of it. And sometimes lifting those insights off of the page of an article and putting them into practice in a company is the hardest part. How does this idea and concept, how is that going to work into my company? How can we actually do this on a day-to-day basis? So application and implementation become our biggest challenges for those of us who are in the industry, those who are managers in the industry that need to, take charge on implementing some of these changes. But we have to do this. We have to find a way. Companies need to assess, how can we start changing the culture? How can we be actively involved in assessing fit when new drivers are coming on board? Because what we've been doing so far isn't working. We have the driver shortage. It's in the headlines, like I said, daily. We need to take time to build trust with drivers through mutual respect. Shift that culture to one of learning instead of, assuming that we have the right answers. We need to consider driver input about everything related to the driver position. We need to consider that fit with new driver training and hiring. And within that process, we have many opportunities along the way to get to know new drivers and just kind of help them understand, is it a good decision for them? And we need to accept the idea that filling seats with those who don't fit will really only produce those short-term results and likely are not going to have a positive impact on any company. Thank you.